Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. If you're with us live or if you're listening to the recording, we are so excited to welcome you to another episode of Mindset, Heartset, Reset. This is our weekly show that provokes introspection, cultivates compassion, and sparks positive change. I'm so excited to have you join us for these authentic conversations that really dig into what practical tools we might be able to use, and through insightful discussions, really bring us into a space where we can nurture empowering mindsets and open hearted connections so that all of us will be able to, through this interaction between us, this beautiful dynamism, to really be able to hit the reset button on our lives, to be able to move forward and to have a beautiful journey on our personal development and growth. I am your host, Dr. Roshana Kashmian. I am a clinical computational and behavioral neuroscientist, and my work is in optimization. My work is with individuals and companies, businesses. I help them to really elevate to the highest version of themselves. I combine science and spirituality, emotional intelligence, and spiritual intelligence to help individuals and businesses become more resourceful, more purposeful, and more prosperous. I am so excited to bring you to another episode in our series on mental health. Mental health is incredibly important. It affects every aspect of our lives, relationships to decision making, of course, the quality of our lives, how we feel about everything. So I'm super excited that Swami Chidananda, our guest, has agreed to join us today. Our episode is called Between Push and Pull, Managing Our Desires and Fears. I am really looking forward to this show. This show is about growth through grace rather than suffering. If you've ever noticed your emotions pulling you one way and then pushing you another way, this is about the complex dance of human emotions that really speak to our behaviors and shape our daily decisions and therefore our daily lives. We use the science and spirituality model to address the idea of how simple attachments can really escalate into complex emotional challenges. And we're using this very interesting model known as the ladder of sorrow to help us learn about the different stages that we might be going through that would start us off innocently enough, but at some point almost predictably, have us dedicated to an end which is undesirable for us, and that would be, of course, suffering. So we're also going to talk about a pivotal emotion along this ladder, along this pathway, that takes us from the internal emotional state to our external actions, and then that can lead to the severe consequences that we just discussed. And one more thing is, we're talking about our past. So how often have we done things that we then regret? What we're going to get through today is talk about how our past experiences serve as really powerful drivers that help shape us in unconscious ways, mostly in our reactions and our decisions. So we are going to learn strategies that will help us intervene before the emotions escalate, and we'll share a blueprint that will help outline the path from frustration to failure and help us avoid hidden traps and pitfalls that will inevitably lead us into that funnel that leads to suffering. So we're hoping that after today, you are going to learn to choose grace over suffering in your path to spiritual and personal growth and development. I'm so excited to welcome our guest, Swami Chidananda. I will read a short bio for him before we go on and let him say hello to us back. Swami Chidananda is a spiritual educator and monk initiated in the Vedic Hari Bhakta lineage, holding the distinguished title of Swami. Through the study of scriptures such as the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Swami has gained a deep understanding of the science of yoga and has devoted his life to helping others on their inner journey. Before entering the spiritual path, he had a successful career as an investment banker and entrepreneur. Now he uses his experiences to convey the ancient yoga systems in a relatable and accessible way for those seeking to reconcile Western and Eastern philosophies. Welcome, Swami Chidananda. I'm so excited to have you here.
Hi, Doctor. Lovely to be here. Thank you for creating this show and this space to have these types of conversations. Looking forward to speaking with you today.
Thank you so much. And actually, I have some incredibly good news when you just said that. I remembered that this morning we got a notification that the Oneness of Humanity Award is being awarded to Steve Farrell and Humanity's Team. So this show is in partnership with Humanity's Team. And we're very excited that we are getting this award in Oneness. Thank you to Neil Donald Walsh and Steve Farrell, who are the founders of Humanity's Team, and for the entire team who works so hard to bring forth, as you say, Swami, these beautiful conversations, transformational education. Humanity's Team is the number one global nonprofit dedicated to transformational education. And so we're very excited that we are able to bring all kinds of programs from incredible speakers and thought leaders from around the world who share of their brilliance, their hearts, their minds, and we can make these beautiful, soulful, one-to-one connections and bring the world into a better space and allow a world in which all can thrive, which is the vision of Mindset, Heartset, Reset. So thank you for that little trigger, Swami.
No problem.
Super excited that you're joining us. Okay, so let's get on with it. I want to start with, we have so much to talk about. And first of all, we're talking about this ladder of sorrow. And the ladder of sorrow is something that I didn't know about. And I'm very excited to get started on. But before we do, let me ask you a question about your personal journey and how you've come to this space. We talked about how you were an entrepreneur and you were in investment banking. And we're doing similar things, right? The East meets West and the beautiful intersection and overlap of how we can better understand and find these tractable ways forward to improve our lives and the lives of everyone else. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Sure. So before I went on the spiritual journey, before I became a monk, as you had mentioned in the bio, I was working in finance and I was also quite successful in that area. But as I started to become more successful, I found that there was actually somewhat of a paradox where more success also meant that I was more anxious, I was more sad, I was more angry. And so as I was reflecting on it, I realized that, at the end of the day, you can win the rat race, but you're still a rat. And that's not something that I really aspire to be. And when I was reflecting on it, I was very much, I would say, atheistic almost, barely agnostic. And I came across a book called The Autobiography of a Yogi, which is a great book that speaks about a saint named Paramahamsa Yogananda who came to the States and started teaching meditation and philosophy. And that book sort of set me off on a journey where I traveled to India and many places around the world. And eventually I met my spiritual teacher, Paramahamsa Swami Vishwananda. And then I studied with him for 10 years in Germany, actually, without any type of internet, without Instagram, without social media, just learning about the nature of who we are. And in 2020, during COVID, my teacher then said, go to the United States and start teaching this philosophy, especially at that time where people really needed it. And through that, I came across this app called Clubhouse, and that's how we connected and that's how we met. And yeah, that's a little bit of a very short version of the story of how I came on this path.
Sorry, I have a way of being speaking into a muted microphone all the time. So when we were talking about this show and what we want to do, and we did have such a wonderful interaction on Clubhouse. It was fantastic. I love your perspective on things. I love your voice itself is so calming, and it brings us back into our bodies and into connection with ourselves. And we start off this whole episode talking about connection and oneness and the resonance that we can have. And so there is really something to be said for this beautiful science that helps us to understand. We know the Dalai Lama is very much involved in bringing forth science that can support the scriptures. And you are well studied, well versed in the Bhagavad Gita. And when we talked about what we would like to bring to the audience today, you mentioned something called the Ladder of Sorrow, and I'd never heard of it, and I was very intrigued. And it's a beautiful blueprint for how we might end up going where most people, especially in the U.S. and the West, we have an allergic reaction to suffering, to states that are not joyful and happy and excited, and right. Although they're quite natural. I always say science is a miser. If we didn't need something, we wouldn't have it. And so we have all these emotions because they're extremely helpful for us. They're extremely useful for us. Everything that we have helps us to be able to navigate this world. This mortal coil serves us. And so it all makes sense. And there are different states and different emotions, right, on this ladder of sorrow. So maybe you could give us just a short introduction to what the ladder of sorrow is, insofar as how, why it came into being, what it serves, what purpose it serves. And then maybe we can go through each of the steps and
Sure.
start to unpack how the path that it describes is a path that could lead us to two different outcomes, one that is more desirable than the other, but both leading to what you told me is growth. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think first is just to understand what is yoga, because a lot of times people have a misconception of what yoga is. And in the West, it's very much external. So it's the body. We call it asanas. So it's very physical. But in reality, yoga means literally translates to come into union with oneself, to understand who we really are. And the way that we attain union is what is called chitta vritti narodaha, which means calming of the fluctuations of the mind. So when we observe our life, we see that actually suffering is not only dependent on the external action that is happening, because we know many people that are going through really difficult times that aren't suffering, right? And we know many people that are billionaires that are suffering. So when we understand that, we understand the nature of suffering is not just something that is external. Suffering is an internal frame of how we view the world. And so the reason why we suffer is because our mind fluctuates. We call this vrittis. So different patterns, different things in our mind starts to fluctuate, and that causes us confusion. And so really yoga is about calming the fluctuations of the mind. And if we do that, then we don't suffer, because then we're able to discern and perceive reality in a much more clear and loving way. And so the Bhagavad Gita, which is a conversation between a warrior and a great enlightened being, speaks about how the mind works. It's said that if you want to solve a problem, 99% of the solution is defining the problem clearly. And so Krishna defines the problem clearly. How does the mind fluctuate? What are the reasons why it fluctuates? And then that is where the ladder of sorrow develops. That's where it came from. It's these steps that lead to the fluctuations of the mind. And then afterwards, of course, he gives the solution, which is at the core very, very simple and basic. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, it's my number one talent apparently. Thank you. So I'm smiling and I'm loving this because, and you know this from our previous conversations, when you start speaking, it always like little light bulbs go off in my head where I find the connection points. And you're talking about all these thoughts, and I'm thinking, yes, that's exactly when we have, what I call runaway thoughts. One thought leads to another, leads to another. If we don't, what I love to say, it's my little trademark, take the reins of your brains. I'm always saying take the reins of your brains because this is an incredible feat of engineering. The greatest feat of engineering known to humans is our brain, which is the central servo that runs this body. And we have 60, 70,000 thoughts a day, and 95% of them are repetitive. About 80% are negative. Just this is a perfect setup to what you were about to explain, right? And if we don't take the reins of our brains, if we don't come into what people like to say, into consciousness or this awareness state, which means you are present, paying attention to what's going on with you internally and what's happening to you externally. So the internal and external environments come into sharp relief. And if we're not paying attention, then like dominoes or like anything that, one, like a wildfire where one little spark can lead to something else further away and quite unexpectedly large compared to how it began. These thoughts are exactly as you say, we are able to take hold of them by intentionally choosing where we will put our focus. And this is all neurobiology. And then being able to then now direct our path as opposed to being, led down some path that we didn't intend. I feel like it's a rudderless boat that floats around and goes wherever the waves throw it, versus being able to direct the brain. And so much of what we're doing when we're thinking intentionally and focusing, in fact, all of it is from our cortical brains. That's the part of the brain that you see when you see a picture of the whole brain. And that's conscious thought, as you're saying. And that prevents us from these, random and leading us down the wrong path, as it were, meaning the path that we don't want. And then you said something else that reminded me of Einstein, that I forget right now, but there was something else that was a perfect connection there. And I thought, oh, yes, 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 this is exactly rooted in hard science. Please, you want to say something?
And also, please, if something comes up, just interrupt me. It's no problem. You don't have to wait till it's finished. I know sometimes this inspiration arises, but just as you were saying, there's another beautiful verse in the Gita. It's in chapter 6 where Krishna says that the mind is the best friend for one who has mastered it, but for one whose mind is unmastered, it can become the worst of enemies. And
I
so in that
remember
way,
learning that in martial arts.
yeah, in that way, the mind, like you said, is such a powerful instrument if we control the reins. If not, then it can drive us crazy.
That's right. A tamed mind is your friend. An untamed mind is your enemy. Can be, right? And so I love that you're bringing all this together so that people can see that science and spirituality are not diametrically opposed, quite far from it. They're just different ways of describing the same thing so that we can have a better science isn't show us reality. Science is here for us to understand what already is so that we can do things like take the reins of our brains. Because sometimes when we have a drive to understand things, and that brings us into a calmer state, because the brain's number one job, of course, is survival. And so when it's something is known, we're like, okay, I can manage what is known, right? What is unknown can be a threat, and we get this threat response. And so I'll lead you into the ladder of sorrow by saying that when we are stressed, as we can be if we're not, in the present, I call it time traveling. You're either going into the past and then you're coming back with regret and depression potentially, or not, a clinical depression, but a depressed state, or you're going into the future in which case you can have anxiety and worry about what could happen. And so, but when we're present, we are in a very different state of being. And when we're in those other two states, we're stressed. And that stress leads us to an amygdala that can become quite active. And we have reactions versus responses and so on and so forth that maybe we don't want. So I turn it over to you to help us start to understand what's the beginning of all of this that might then lead us into those stress states.
Thank you. So, yes, this ladder of sorrow, it has approximately 7 steps to it. And the first step on this ladder has to do with us processing what we see with this reality. And doctor, please jump in if there's any thoughts that you'd like to share about it. But
Thank
in
you.
the Vedic tradition, we say that this entire reality is processed through our 5 senses. So our 5 senses interact with this reality, and then the interaction creates impressions in our brains. And most of the time, when we're going around doing our daily activities, we're processing thousands, if not millions, of impressions all the time. Right? But every once in a while, one of these impressions, it sticks. It's something that stays in the mind longer than all the other things that come and go subconsciously. So, let's take an example. I think it's nice to have an example as we work through this ladder of sorrow. So, let's say you came to a talk with doctor and myself, and there was a group of people that came. And so, as we were talking, you process all of the other people that have come. Let's say there's 100 people. You process them. You don't think twice about them. And as the talk is about to begin, all of a sudden you see somebody walk in, and that person that walks in is the one that you had fallen in love with in high school that broke your heart. Okay, so let's give that person a name. Let's say Brad. So Brad walks in, and even though you process all of these various people, all of these things, and you haven't thought twice about it, the moment Brad comes in, you start to think, what are they doing here? Why are they here? How did they know about this? I haven't seen them in so long. They look quite nice. They look attractive, right? So all of these thoughts start to come, and you start deliberating on Brad. Okay, so anything that you see externally, we'll call that an object. So Brad is an object. And so in the first ladder of the sorrow, it's called deliberation, where you start to think about something in a higher frequency than everything else around you. And as Dr. Roshanak said, it's like a runaway train. So imagine that we're coming to the top of a mountain and we're a car, and we start to go down a hill. So the first step, or the first part of the hill as we go down, is deliberation. And then we'll see where that leads to next. But I'll open it up for Doctor if she wants to add any insights on deliberation before we move forward. I think you're on mute.
I've never been on mute so much. It's perfect. Thank you so much, Swami. So, this could be related to um, the states that we come into that lead us from the brain in the default mode network into these negative states. So these negative states that come into that we are experiencing, and I would like to give enough time for you to go through the whole ladder and for us to go through the blueprints. When we ruminate, they're called ruminating thoughts. You know how I said that so many of those thoughts are negative. We get these ruminating thoughts, and then we can also catastrophize. And so these happen in a particular part of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex. And actually, interestingly, depression also is found to come from this same area. So that's rooted in the same part of the brain. So when we start to and it depends also what happens with our childhood with attachment. So there's a couple different things going on here. One is actual attachment. So it was thought that attachment is something that is learned. And then experiments very briefly showed that that's not true. There were experiments done with baby monkeys. There were two wire hanger mothers, and one had the food, and one was covered in this soft, cozy, cuddly fabric. And the baby monkey spent all its time with the cuddly mom and went over to the other one just to eat, and then came back to the cuddly mom. And especially when it was scared, it would latch on to the cuddly mom. And so this idea that you just, have this attachment because there's a caretaker that's feeding you is untrue, and that it's learned is untrue. So we start with different attachment styles that we have based on whether or not there is reliability and stability in the interaction between the baby and its primary caretaker. Now, what people think is that that attachment style that I have is forever and for everyone, which is not true. It can change, and it can be different with different people. So because you brought up the relationship, so that brings in these ideas of attachment and attachment theory. But based on these processes of rumination and catastrophizing, where we have these negative thoughts. So you might go on a first date and then it doesn't go well. And then you catastrophize, meaning that you're like, well, I'll never get married. I'm going to die alone. Nobody loves me. That's catastrophizing. We go right down, like you were saying, at high speeds into these states that cause us suffering and stress. And as I mentioned, intentional thought. So things work in our brains and bodies sometimes as like what I call the gas and the brakes. So like if you're stressed out and you go into fight or flight, right? That's the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system that we all call fight or flight, that is active during that time. And when we take a deep breath and come back into the present, we activate the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the brakes that we call rest and digest. So we come into a greater calm state. And so it's the same thing in the brain. I feel like not that I feel like, it's been shown that there are these sort of brakes and gas, where one area is for rumination, but the other is for considered thought. So things like journaling, which is thought of as just a spiritual maybe practice, is actually rooted in hard science. We have to think about what we're writing. That is considered thought. And that keeps us from this rumination and brings us into a space where we can now start to examine our attachments, our thoughts, etc., and be able to manage them at that first stage that you're talking about, to keep us from spiraling down. Or if we don't, as you say, we might then go to the next step of the ladder.
Thank you. You mentioned the next step quite often as you just spoke, because when we start to deliberate, so we'll go back to this example of Brad. So we start deliberating upon Brad, and as I'm speaking and you're listening, you're part of this talk. Even though you hear me speak, all you hear is blah, 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 blah.
Yes.
Your mind is ruminating, deliberating. I would say it's actually interchangeable, those two terms, on Brad. Right? Why is Brad here? How did he get here? So let's say the talk finishes. You and Brad don't really speak to each other. He doesn't even probably know that you're there, but you've now just spent the last hour thinking about him. And now you go home. Right. So the moment you go home, what's the natural next thing that one would do? Because we live in an interesting time, I would say the first thing that you would probably do is go on Instagram and look up Brad's profile and to see what is he doing? Why was he there? What's going on with Brad? And as you start to look into Brad's profile, if the thoughts are ruminating enough, then you're going to enter into this phase of doom scrolling, where next thing you know, you spend 3 hours looking at Brad's life. You know everything about his life. You know his tax ID number. You know his social security number. You know his dog's name. You know everything about him. And so
I'm dying over here. This is so good. I know there are people in the audience going, I love it.
Yeah, so this next step, what happens is a very important distinction is that when you are doom scrolling, when you are going to the next step, even when you tell yourself, I don't want to do this, there is an impulse to continue to do it. And this is called, for us, this is how we're defining attachment. So, attachment is when a deliberation becomes strong enough where even if you tell yourself, I don't want to think about Brad, I don't want to reflect on Brad, you cannot help but to do so. Right? So that's the next step on the ladder.
The only thing I would say to that that comes to mind is that when we think of something, do you ever notice that when you're hungry, everything you see is about food, right? Everything you read, everything somebody says, you see a billboard, you're driving down, whatever, it's always about food. That's a known process in the brain. So when we are focused on something, when we are perseverating, as it's called, our brains then connect to all things that it associates with that thing, and that serves to even strengthen that thing that you're thinking about, because now as it's like a, the more you're going into this, the more that one has the other associations and so on and so forth. And so it's now your focus unconsciously has gone to something. Your focus has been directed. You don't have the reins of your brains. You don't have control over what you're focusing on and thinking about, because you're actually not. And so Einstein was a huge fan of daydreaming. And back then we didn't have the language that's known as the default mode network, which is what becomes very active. It's quite a large network connecting many regions of the brain that becomes active when we are not focusing on something. So if we're just relaxing, daydreaming, right? We're not falling asleep. We're here, but we're not really focused on anything. And it's wonderful for innovation because so many things can connect to each other. But you can see how also those connections can relate to what you're talking about. And so this idea of perseveration is also in an unconscious part of the brain, similar to habits. So this can also be a habitual behavior where you do this sort of thing like you're talking about. And that is a process of optimization of the brain that serves it very well, because the brain takes up 2% of your body's weight, but uses at least 20% of its energy. And so when you do something over and over again, it drops down into the unconscious brain. And that area that runs habits is very similar to that area that is for impulse. So being able to control our impulses is also in, for example, areas like the ACC, anterior cingulate cortex, and so on, and bringing us into a conscious state where we're paying attention to what we're doing. And then I want to really bring forth what you showed to me when we talked about this initially, is that we have a choice and we can come off this ladder before it gets too late, as it were. And so in this point, we can pay attention and go, oh, I see what's happening, and make that choice to then redirect our attention and our focus so that it's not barreling down with all those things that are the connection points as we sort of daydream or go into this default mode network functioning of sort of autopilot, and it goes where it goes without us deciding where that's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you said was it's really nice. You're redefining the words. I used deliberation, you said ruminating, attachment, you used the big word that I can't probably pronounce, perseverating.
Oh,
You said
perseverate. Like when you think about, like when you persevere, you keep going in some direction. Perseverate is when you're like focused on one thing. Think of it as almost a compulsion.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I would define as attachment. It's like where your focus is on one thing and you cannot bring yourself to focus on anything else. Of course, focus by itself is a very positive quality, but it all depends on what you focus on, which we'll get to a bit later. But right now in our story, we're focused on Brad. And I don't know if that's probably a good thing or a bad thing. We'll see how the rest of the ladder plays out.
Let's see what happens. It's a great story. I want to see where it goes.
So when we've now spent a lot of time deliberating and then attaching ourselves to Brad, it said that the next thing that happens is that naturally, if we spend a lot of time thinking about Brad, reflecting on Brad, then the natural next step would be that you want to get to know Brad. You want to be with Brad. Especially if Brad is somebody that you had, let's say, fallen in love with, and now somehow he broke your heart, something happened. So there's still some residual feelings of the past that's still there, which is now awakened. So the next thing on this ladder is what we call desire. So desire naturally awakens to receive or get that which you become attached to, right? So you can reflect on this in many ways. If you start to think about cigarettes a lot, then naturally you want to smoke a cigarette. If you think about alcohol a lot, naturally you'll want to go to the bar. So whenever you have these uh, attachments that you're reflecting on, that's going to produce a desire. Okay, so the desire is very, very important. It takes on two natures. Desire has two natures. One type of desire is called raga or attraction. And in example of Brad, it is raga. I'm attracted to Brad, and now I desire to be with him. Right? So there's an attraction to get what we want. The other type of desire is called dvesha or aversion. This is when it's the opposite. I desire to not have something. I desire to not be around something. And so an example would be I'm sitting in the plane, and there's a person next to me and they keep snoring, so I keep ruminating. Now I can't stop thinking about them snoring, and then the next desire is I need to get away. I need to get up. I need to go somewhere. I just cannot be around them. So there's a desire to run away, right? So desire is of two: attraction and aversion. And so in this third step of the ladder, from attachment naturally arises a desire to gain something or to go away from something that we have found ourselves becoming attached to. Okay, so here, now we become attached to Brad and we desire to be with him. And so now there's another talk that is happening where Swami and Doctor are going to be there. It's going to be next week, right? So what do? In my mind, I desire to be with Brad. So I dress up very nicely. I look very nice. I put on makeup. I take a shower. I put on perfume. And I go to this talk hoping to see Brad again and then ask for his number. Okay, so that's the next step on the ladder is desire. So if you're following along, it's deliberation, attachment, and desire. And so this is sort of like the runaway train or car that is barreling down a mountain slope. So we're kind of in the middle of it right now. I can continue unless, Doctor, you'd like to share something on desire. I think you're on mute.
Are you guys entertained? Um, so I'll just say very briefly that desire is an incredibly powerful driver of behavior because we work on a reward system. The reward system is incredibly important and powerful and ancient. It's been around in much simpler organisms for ages. And without it, we really probably would never get up or eat or do anything. And so there's a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens that is important for reward and anticipate something. And that's what I was thinking when you were talking about this. When we anticipate something, the nucleus accumbens becomes active and we're looking forward to something pleasurable. We get a hit of dopamine. That's the reward we get when we anticipate something. And it's very motivational for us, which is why we do all the things that we do. It's all based on reward. Without reward, we would do nothing. People think that dopamine is just about pleasure, but it's really about drive, motivation, anticipation, etc. And so there is nothing more powerful really than drive. Motivation is that exactly that. It makes you do something. It motivates you to take action. And so do not underestimate the power of desire because of this reward system and because of the powerful neurotransmitters and opioids that are involved in the cascade of in the process of what happens when we are motivated, anticipating, seeking for, and receiving. And so we get the dopamine, which is what people call the feel-good neurotransmitter. We get serotonin, which we know is about mood and emotion. It's a modulator, and it modulates our desires. And we get, of course, opioids, which are in, we have endogenous opioids that the brain releases. A lot of people know it as like runner's high, for example. And this is really important because you can't fight biology and evolution, and such a powerful driver as this. Um, and that's how we also learn and adapt, right? If we weren't constantly going forward and getting reward for different things, because actually get the highest hit of dopamine for what is known as positive prediction error, which is something you didn't expect but that was good and you got. And so that's how we learn and we adapt and we change and we grow. And so I love that you're bringing this up, and that we're slowly but surely getting to the point of no return in this ladder, in this funnel. So the advice from what you're saying and from what I understand is to, by the time you get to desire, your alarm should be going off, that you need to pay attention and start to potentially, I would say definitely redirect yourself so that you don't go barreling down a path you don't want to go down. So I just want to bring up the importance of the strong, powerful, and for good reason, biological driver of desire, but not if it's just, again, like wild horses going wherever they want to go.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept that you brought up, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this idea of, for us in this Vedic tradition, we say we're classifying a difference between material desire, so a desire to gain something externally, an object,
Right.
where there's some gratification. And so we say that one of the qualities of who we are is called ananda, or bliss. So that's
Right.
our natural state, is to be blissful, to be
Yes.
joyful.
Yes.
But because we're under the influence of ignorance called avidya, we have forgotten our true nature, which is to be blissful. Our mind has made us believe that that bliss can be found in things externally.
Right.
And so in that way, I want to be happy, you want to be happy, a criminal, a homeless person, whoever's out there, everybody wants to be happy, right? There's
Yep.
nobody that doesn't want to be happy. But when you don't have that deeper understanding, you look for that happiness externally. But when you have a deeper understanding, you say, okay, that ananda, that bliss that I'm looking for, to find that, I have to turn within. And so when I go within, I experience a bliss that has one quality, which is it is not impermanent. Because it is said that everything in this reality is impermanent. So if I gain some joy or happiness from something, two things will either happen. One is I will lose it, or the other is I won't derive the same amount of happiness from it. And so
Mhm.
the happiness I derive goes down, or I lose it. But some way or another, it's not going to last. And so spirituality, it speaks about going within, feeling a deeper joy that is not dependent on something external. So I would ask you, so we had mentioned how an external desire gives you dopamine. Would you say like an internal feeling of peace and joy exhibits a different type of chemical, or how would you put that?
It's no. So what we've unfortunately become, especially in the U.S. and the West, accustomed to are quick hits of dopamine. We are pleasure seeking. We are looking for the reward because it is a powerful driver, as I said. And so there are different ways that we're able to get that quick. It's not artificial, but it's not natural. How do you like that? Where we're looking and anticipating and seeking for the next hit and the next hit and the next hit. We're like dopamine addicts at this point, and dopamine is a powerful neurotransmitter in the addiction pathway and the changes that occur in the brain when we are unfortunately addicted. And people think that an addict feels good. That's why they're going for the whatever it is, the object of their addiction. or the substrate of their addiction. But in fact, it's to fulfill the drive and to respond to that expectancy. Many addicts will tell you they don't feel good. They're just getting the reward. And it's not pleasurable. They're not feeling happy or good. It doesn't feel good to be an addict. And so it's a terrible state, unfortunately. And there are natural processes that are longer lasting, as you were quite correctly saying. So when we go out into nature, for example, when we have beautiful relationships, good, strong, stable relationships, which, by the way, the Harvard study on adult development shows is the number one single most important influence. So there are multiple influences, but this one, as opposed to all of them together, on health and longevity and happiness. So if you want to be happy and live long to enjoy that happiness, good, stable relationships. So there are these natural ways that you would say internal, and I would say the internal and the external are inseparable. Because as you said in the very beginning, you're receiving everything through your senses. And you have an internal environment and an external environment, and they're in constant communication with each other. You're constantly sampling what's going on in the external and internal environment, again, for the sake of your survival. So not being not being enslaved, as it were, directed, as it were, by all the external inputs that may have you with a quick hit would be, I think, the answer to your question, where you can get the dopamine, you can get the reward, but you can do it either through multiple quick hits, like what is known as extrinsic motivation, versus intrinsic motivation. When you're doing something that you're passionate about, I would say the science of it is that you have a powerful internal driver. The spirituality of it is in alignment with your soul's purpose. And so when you are in a space that you are doing what comes naturally to you, that means it is, I teach this all the time when it comes to identity and meaning. The first and oldest maxim, one of them is know thyself, right? That's from the oracle of Delphi, the temple of Apollo. And it's the oldest maxim is know thyself. But then Shakespeare comes along and says, to thine own self be true. So there's a journey where you know yourself and disabuse yourself of all the things that pushed and pulled you to create an identity that is quite changeable. And we'll talk about that another time. And then there is once you get to that place where you come back into complete alignment of what really lights you up, because the number one regret of the dying is, I wish I'd lived a life that was true to myself and not what others wanted for me. So now you're living that life. Then the to thine own self be true is doing all the things that keep you in that alignment, because so many things on the outside will pull and push us out of that alignment. So then if we're pulled out of that alignment, we might look for a quick dopamine hit, or we got something that was a quick dopamine hit. And remember, the learning and the adaptation, if we're not paying attention, we could then go down this sort of primrose path that ultimately leads to suffering, versus the one that we know is guaranteed to have us in grace and joy, which is, as you said earlier, you can be in a state that could be difficult and be sad, but still on a deeper level be joyful. So it's like the waves that are the emotions that are constantly changing of happiness and sadness, but in the deeper level is that of joy and bliss, which like the stillness in the depth of the ocean.
Yes, and I think this is an important thing to understand for people, is that stillness, that ananda, that bliss is something beyond a dopamine hit, right? It's a deeper sense of calmness and peace, which is not dependent on anything happening externally.
Well, it's still dopamine, but it's a more stable state, right?
Mhm.
So it's not the quick hit that then you just go for one quick hit after another, that extrinsic motivation. It's now you're in that intrinsic motivation. Because you are in that. And remember, serotonin is one of the other, as a mood modulator, one of the other neurotransmitters that's involved in this process. So being able to connect to what is keeping you in a stable, good state versus the unstable reward that you're getting over and over again by seeking externally. And we know from intrinsic motivation, for example, and you are in the world of business, right? Um, when we have intrinsic motivation, we work harder, we work longer, and we're happier doing it because it's that intrinsic motivation.
I see. So you're saying there's two types of dopamines. One that's more,
Well, there's the positive prediction error, and then there's the opposite, which is the negative prediction error. Something worse that happens that was unexpected, that really powerfully also has a strong biological response, neurobiological response, internally, and physiological response. So we are sort of approach avoidance, right? And where do we find that?
this attraction and aversion that I was speaking about earlier. This raga and dvesha.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, so we can continue with the ladder. I think we were at deliberation, attachment, and desire. And so just to build on that, right? So the person comes in, they get dressed up very nicely for Brad, and they come to the talk, and as they enter in, they see Brad. But this time, Brad doesn't come alone. Brad comes with his girlfriend. And so now the moment that you see the girlfriend, the next step on the ladder is anger. There is an anger, there is a frustration. Why does Brad have a girlfriend? Why did he do all of these things, right? So Brad has no idea you're even there. Brad just came for the talk. But in your head, you created this whole thing about why I can't have what I desire, right? So the next step on the ladder, we say, is anger. Anger arises when you don't get that which you desire. So in this case, there's anger that arises because you cannot have Brad. But the very interesting thing about anger is that who is this anger directed at? Many people will say, well, it's directed at Brad. But actually, in reality, anger is not directed at Brad. Anger is directed at that which you perceive is stopping you from being with Brad. And so here, the anger could be towards his girlfriend, right? Because you perceive his girlfriend as a direct conflict to you being with Brad. The anger could be yourself because you feel insecure. I'm not worthy to be with Brad. I'm not good enough to be with Brad. The anger could be at your external environment, maybe your parents, like maybe my parents should have taught me better and therefore I could be with Brad. It's a very trivial example, but to give you an understanding, is that anger is always going to be directed at that which you perceive is stopping you from getting what you desire. And anger will always arise when you follow the path of material gratification, because only two things will happen when you do that. Because when we understand the nature of material happiness, we understand it's impermanent. So you either get what you desire and you're happy for a moment in time, but eventually we'll get to a point where you will not get that which you desire. It is said if a human being is given everything in this material universe, not even this world, this entire universe, if they get everything, they will still not be happy. They will still want more. That is the nature of desire, is that if you only look at it from the external perspective, no matter what you get, you will not be happy. Because that which you're looking for, that ananda you're looking for, is something eternal. It's something beyond this reality, right? We can call it purpose, we can call it connection, we can call it many different things. Depending on how you view the divine, the source, you can interpret it different ways. But ultimately, what you're looking for is something beyond what you can gain from this material reality. So eventually, they will get to a point where you will not get that which you desire. And at that point, you will then experience anger, not at the object, but at that which you perceive is stopping you from getting what you want. Okay, so that's the next step on the ladder. If doctor, if you wanted to share on that, or I can keep going.
I will say one thing because I believe you had said that this is the pivotal, this is like the point of no return, right? This is the pivotal um, rung on the ladder that gets us to, dedicates us to a path that, ends potentially with severe consequences and certainly undesirable ones. So anger is a violation of expectation or a blockage of goals. And as you said, the goal of getting Brad has been blocked. And now, because you believed that you could have had him, because anger and frustration are about your beliefs. And so, because you believed you could have had him, because you believe this goal was, a viable goal, then now you are angry. And it's a very powerful emotion because it can be very destructive and it can be quite constructive. It's a strong motivator because when our goals are blocked, um, when our um, when our expectations are violated, we start paying attention. And when we pay attention, we're like, what happened? And what do I need to change? So it's a very strong driver of change. And that's the constructive part of anger. But the destructive part, of course, we're pretty much familiar with. And so a lot of people, when they get angry, they'll be like, let me suppress my anger. And that's always a bad idea because um, you're suppressing any positive emotions you may have, and you're increasing your negative emotions are still there, and the person that you're trying to like not be angry at, actually their blood pressure goes up and they feel worse. So your negative states are increasing. And then people think, okay, well, then I'll just let it go. I'll let it rip. That's obviously a bad idea, right? Because these emotion generative areas in the brain, like the amygdala, that respond to such um, powerful emotions and is the threat detector, the amygdala, they become really active. So it's always about reappraisal that allows us to get into because anger only lasts a couple of few seconds. And then your prefrontal cortex can then, is connected to your amygdala and then says, hey, slow down, stop, wait a minute. And this is taking the reins of your brains. And so you can get yourself into a space where you are habitually, we talked about habit, doing something, saying, well, that's just anger. I'm used to doing this, and this, which can lead to those consequences that would be negative and cause suffering. You might do something very bad when you're angry that Brad is with his girlfriend, right? You might embarrass yourself by doing something. You might, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's important to then redirect. That's a reappraisal and change the story because it's about the belief, right? And then that can put water on the fire. Or you can distract yourself. You can shift your focus to something else, do something else, because now you're coming into the same pool um, of these resources. And when you do something else and then come back to the thing that blocked your goal, then so you can have like a conversation with Brad afterwards when you've calmed down because you've redirected. Spiritually you could say, well, I've redirected my energy, and that would be true, but also now you're coming back to a different pool of resource where you're able to more clearly see and speak in a way that would be constructive rather than destructive.
That's beautifully put, and I think this is very important because people will say, well, sometimes anger is good, and that's very true. We're not saying that anger is a bad thing, that anger is a negative thing.
It is
Anger
negative,
just
but it's necessary. That's why we have it. It is
exactly,
hardwired into the brain, but only for a
exactly,
couple of seconds
exactly.
to
So
bring your attention
anger,
to something that needs your attention.
yes, anger, as you said, anger allows us to bring our attention to the fact that we've gone 4 steps into the ladder, right? So anger does a great job in making us aware of the situation that we find ourselves in. And if we're able to harness that energy in the proper way, then we can see that it will actually benefit us. Then it will make us say, oh, wait a second, why did I go into all of this? Let me take a step back. So I would not say that we're trying to suppress anger, trying to remove anger. We're just trying to say, harness that anger in the correct way to help you to do your duty in the best way possible moving forward. So it's a very beautiful energy to have if you know how to utilize it properly. And so we'll see in the, by the way, before we continue, I see it's 1 hour. Is
I know
it
we have to sort of rush through the rest of it. So,
okay? How much time do we have? A few minutes?
well, our production team is incredible. Again, Jim Gray and Garth Carterell are fabulous, and they allow us overrun. So
Okay. I'll
let's
try to.
do the best
I'll
that we
try,
can to be
try to
efficient.
be quick. I'll try to be quick. And so when we become angry, what happens is in this particular moment, let's say the anger is directed at that which we cannot have. And let's say it's Brad's girlfriend. So immediately I run over to Brad's girlfriend. Before I go to actually Brad's girlfriend, I stand up. Right? So let's say me and you are having a conversation, you're at the talk, I stand up. I start huffing and puffing. I start walking around. I start, you know, screaming a bit, and then I see a lamp and I push it over because I'm angry, and I start acting in this way, in this behavior where now everybody's looking at me like, what's wrong with this person, right? And all of this is because you've thought in your head that Brad is doing this on purpose. He's brought his girlfriend on purpose. And so when you're doing all of these things, what does everybody think that you are? I would say everybody thinks that you're crazy, right? That you've gone crazy. But do you think that you are crazy? No. You think you're perfectly justified. You think it's perfectly justifiable that I should walk around and scream, that I should tip over the the lamp. And in your head, you'd say, well, everybody else would do the exact same thing if Brad treated them in that same way. And so, what we see here in the next step is actually delusion. Delusion arises when we're not able to understand why we are angry. When we don't have that understanding, we go into delusion and we start acting in a crazy way. While we think we're justified, everybody else knows the truth that this person is not something correct about them. And so we have to be very, very careful here. Because if you look at your own life and you observe when you're angry, you look back and you say, man, I acted in such a stupid way. I did such a crazy thing, right? And I'll never do it again. I can't believe I did that. But then, of course, the next time you do the same thing. So then the next step on the ladder is delusion. So if we were to really break it down, deliberation, attachment, desire, anger, and then delusion. Okay. And this is something we have to be very careful about. Um, Doctor, if you wanted to say anything on this, we can, or I could finish up with the last two if we're
I
running
would
out of.
love for you to, yes, please.
So when we become delusional and we start acting in this way, let's say I see you acting like this, and you've come to many previous talks that I've done, and so I go over to you and I say, hey, just relax, take it easy, don't be so frustrated. Now, if you've really gone into that delusional state, what are you going to say to me? You're going to flick me off. You're going to say, get lost, get away from me. You don't know what you're talking about, right? So even though you've listened to me speak all of these times about all of these different concepts, you've heard me and say, wow, Swami knows what he's talking about. In that moment of delusion, you forget all of those things and you start seeing red. So from delusion arises loss of memory. You forget about all of the things that you've learned. You forget about all of the things that you told yourself you're never going to do again. And in this loss of memory, you go over to Brad's girlfriend and you hit her. And that's the last step on the ladder, which is the destruction of discernment. So you end up doing something which you are immediately going to regret. At the moment you hit her and the anger is dissipated, you think to yourself, oh my God, what was I thinking? I was delusion. I forgot everything Swami was saying. I can't believe I did that. And so in the Vedic tradition, this is called entanglement, or what we refer to as karma. It's where we do something where we entangle ourselves and there's repercussions that we have to deal with. And in this case, the repercussion would be that Brad's girlfriend's probably going to sue you, and now you have to go to to court, right? So every action done from this ladder of sorrow has repercussions, and those repercussions then cause us to suffer. So the suffering comes at the end when you take an action that you regret, and now you have to deal with the repercussions that they offer. So that's sort of like I kind of sped through the last part of the ladder. But the most important thing to understand is that delusion leads to loss of memory. Loss of memory leads to the destruction of discernment, and the destruction of discernment creates suffering or entanglement in our life. So if you understand this ladder and you observe and contemplate on it, the next time you find yourself going into it, I think it'll be very useful in helping you to make a decision that you won't regret in the future.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. It was amazing. I love it. I think cognitive dissonance goes in there somewhere with us, believing that we're one way, but then acting another. And then we have to rationalize why our beliefs are not in integrity with our actions, right? So
Exactly.
thank you for explaining this. This is wonderful. Is now we have a blueprint for how we end up where we don't want to be and in trouble in hot water, etc. I would ask you this: now that we understand the pathway, could you start speaking to practical strategies and tools? What would be, and we talked about this a little bit along the way, but what do you recommend as some techniques for intervention that might prevent these emotions from escalating and leading us to poor decisions?
Sure. So as you had mentioned, there's some moments in the ladder where you can really look and say, okay, I can stop myself here. But of course, the further you go into the ladder, it's almost like the further the car rolls down the hill and the harder it will be to brake. And so, initially, on the early stages of the spiritual path, where you can find yourself reflecting on is the stage of anger, because anger is a very emotional energy that you cannot ignore, right? So, in that
Powerful,
moment, you say, okay,
powerful
wait a
time.
second, I have to change, right? But as you start doing your practices, the awareness becomes more subtle. And eventually you'll find yourself in the phase of attachment where you say, wait, I've been deliberating a bit too much. I don't want to get attached and go into this ladder. But that takes a lot of time, because to stop at attachment, it takes a lot of self awareness, a lot of practice. So, till then, look at anger, look at that emotion, and see how you can change there. Because the moment you get into delusion, it's game over. I've not really ever seen somebody that's gone into delusion come out of it before performing an action that causes repercussions. And unless you have a great spiritual teacher, you're not going to be able to break through delusion. You're going to need a hammer. And yeah, so I found that usually anger is where you can start and then work your way back to attachment if you really want to stop the ladder. Now, one of the best ways to do that, I'll just give a very simple solution, is through a practice called mantra chanting. Okay, so man means mind, and tra is the short for trayate, which means to uplift. So mantra means a process of uplifting the mind, purifying the mind. And so when you chant a mantra repeatedly, what happens is that you change your North Star as to what your mind is focusing on. So
Mm,
when your mind is focusing on the material world, the nature of this world is that it varies. There's always ups and downs and dualities. So if you're focused very much on that, guess what's going to happen to your mind? It's also going to go like this, right? So mantras are very specific vibrations that have been taught for thousands of years by great yogis, that were revealed through meditations, that contain a vibration. If you chant it repeatedly and immerse your mind in that vibration, it uplifts the mind, right? So the mantra carries an energy of what we would say is love. It's not of this world. It's something beyond this world that uplifts the mind. So I would say a very simple practice is take up a mantra, a mantra that you get from a respected teacher and from a tradition, a mantra that's been around, that's withstood the test of time, and immerse yourself in the constant chanting of the mantra. And by doing that, you'll see that your mind will become purified and will become uplifted.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I was going to ask you about actually, so this is mindset, heart set, reset. So I was going to ask you about what we can do. So that sounds like it's a long-term strategy that
Mhm.
can actually help us build resilience. So many people come to me, they go, how can I be more resilient? And resilience is really about being able to, recover from what happens and have a new set point and, to be able to cope with what's going on. And adaptability, as we talked about with motivation and the reward system, adaptability, which is in the moment and being open-minded and being able to change your behavior, leads to resilience. And so I think what you're showing us is a way that leads to a more, by changing our pattern into a state where we can cope better and then recover from whatever happens. Is that correct?
Exactly. Exactly.
Great. So that's a long term. Is there something in the short term or something that helps us with our mindset that can bring
Mhm.
us, that can be a great tool for us to be able to um manage and avoid the pitfalls and traps, or when we're in it, that
Mhm.
can help us to better manage our desires. We
Sure.
talked about anger, but we have desires and fears. And so
Mhm.
when we're talking about love and fear and desire and fear and the push and the pull of our emotions, how can we use our mindset to help us with that push and pull of those emotions, in particular desire and fear?
Yes, it's a very interesting question because it's difficult in those moments to think clearly, right? This is where we go into that delusional state, that fantasy state, and and we forget loss of memory. We forget
But what
all
about
of
a desire? That's before. That's two steps before, right?
at that point. At that point, okay. So I would say there, I gave this practice of mantra chanting, and it is long term. And also it's short term. When somebody does that mantra chanting every day, I know so many people from all facets of life, they say, it's helped me so much. Before I start my day, before I go to work, I do 10 minutes of constant repetition. It's a constant repetition of immersing the mind in a different vibration. And they said that helped me to be so much clearer in the decision making during the day. And so for me, that it seems to be the most powerful and simplest way to be clear is just spend 5 minutes. It doesn't even have to be mantra, just 5 minutes in an energy, in a vibration that helps you to center yourself, right? It could be something else. I don't know, journaling, practicing
Breathing,
gratitude, breathing, great.
right?
So
We could
all
do
of
that in
these
like 1 second anywhere we are.
Yes, so all of these are very helpful. Of course, I'm a bit biased because the one that I teach and that I like and that I find effective is the mantra chanting. But all of these practices and any of these practices that helps you to recenter for the day, the beginning of the day, that's very important. Do it in the beginning of the day because as you go through the day, you go into the battlefield of life. So when you're in the middle of the battlefield, it's very hard, but when you do it before you enter the battlefield, it will equip you with the right weapons to handle all of these things coming at you.
I love it. So recenter in the beginning of the day, or center in the beginning of the day. And then I guess if you have this habit,
Mm. I would say
um,
center through a practice which has the essence of this vibration of calmness and peace.
I love
That's
that.
important.
Thank you. And with habits, we know they're quite quick because conscious thought, etc., is longer and more energy intensive. So if we develop this habit of chanting from the moment that we have the first chant, it immediately, and also because of the associations with the brain, it's like a conditioned response. Pavlov and the Pavlovian dogs, where you ring the bell and the dog salivates. It's not a natural. So Pavlov was studying salivation in dogs and the physiology of it, and do dogs salivate, when they're hungry and eating and so on, and noticed that when the research assistant's footsteps approached, the dogs would begin to salivate at the sound of the footsteps, and then did this other experiment, which is much better known, that is ring a bell and feed the dog. And so the dog starts to associate the bell with food. And so a natural process like salivation occurs when there's an unrelated stimulus, that would be the bell. So if we get ourselves into a habit, then the moment we start the chant, we associate it with that calm centering. And so we can very quickly jump into that. Right? So I love that. And so start off the day centered. And prayer does that, right? It connects us. It allows us to recenter. In Islam, you have praying 5 times a day. And the first one is at the very beginning of the day. Early in the morning, you center, you connect. And then one of the really important ones is at noon, smack in the middle of the day, when you're likely to have totally forgotten and gotten off kilter, right? So you go back and you recenter. And then when your day is done is one of the other ones that is also quite powerful, because you're again now, and it's a resetting from, we love reset, from what you've been doing all day, and then you're going home to something different. So you're not carrying all of that with you when you go home. And so each of them, maybe you had a very stressful day, and each of them brings you into another state of centering, recentering, and sort of wiping that slate clean, which brings us back to when we were ruminating and having these runaway thoughts. We know we're taking the reins of our brains and stopping that and having intentional states of being, right?
Perfectly
So
said.
thank you so much. I'm learning from you.
All learning from each other.
That's a beauty. That's the beauty of life. We need each other. Okay, so Grace, you said to me something very important as we start to slowly wrap this up. That growth, we can choose suffering or grace on the path to growth. We're going to grow anyway. We're going to grow anyway. So that growth can happen through this ladder of sorrow, where there are tremendous repercussions and consequences and suffering, etc., what we would like to avoid. Or this can happen through grace, which is the other path, where there is no suffering. Can you please speak a little bit to the grace for growth pathway?
So I would say grace, it's a Sanskrit term called kripa, which just literally translates to inspire. Grace means to inspire. And ultimately, if we look at it from a spiritual lens, it's to inspire us to understand more about who we are, right? Know thyself, to inspire us to know ourselves. And so, whenever we go through this whole ladder of sorrow, what happens is that at the end, it always leads to repercussions and suffering. But the beautiful thing is that if you do it enough times, you will develop a scar. And that scar will be so deep that when you just look at it, immediately you jump off the ladder, right? That the suffering will be so deep, you look at it and you're like, okay, no, thank you. And so, from that perspective, even that is a form of grace. Even suffering is a form of grace to help us, to inspire us to transform. Now, if you don't want to go through that step, then what you can do is receive grace from various teachings. For example, mantra chanting is a form of grace. If you do that every single day in the morning, you will see that you will not suffer as much. You will not go through the ladder as much. And you will grow more without nature having to teach you. So I would say look for something to inspire you to change, which is not suffering, and that's your grace. And grace comes in many forms. Grace comes in listening to this talk. Grace comes in the form of a book. Grace might come in the form of a family member. Grace might come in a form of a mantra or a spiritual teacher. So there's many ways that you can access grace in this world. And it's anything that will inspire you to know who you are.
I love that. That is beautiful. Um, so, how do we cultivate or prime ourselves to have or be present to more grace? Maybe compassion comes into that also.
I will give two examples, and they both start with S. So the first is called Sangha or community. Look for a community that shares the same values as you. Because if there's a saying, if you hang around a smoker long enough, you'll become a smoker. If you hang around a saint long enough, you'll become a saint. And so it's very important the type of people you spend your time and energy with. And no matter how much you want to change, if the people around you don't want to, it will also make you go dormant in your inspiration to change. You will just go through life in the same way they all are. But no matter how badly you don't want to change, if you're around others that do, they will uplift you, they will carry you with them. And so figure out a community that you want to be around, that you want to share your life with, that inspires you. And that will automatically help you to step into grace more. The second is called seva, which means selfless service. So many of us were conditioned to perform action based on a result. So there's expectation of a result. And so that expectation can be, I do this, I gain money. I do this, I get an emotional um, acknowledgement that you're great, you're amazing, blah, blah, blah. And that's how most of us perform all of our action. But when you do seva, it's when you do something where you don't expect anything. Right? Go and help the homeless without anybody looking to see if you did it or not. Go and take your mother out for dinner, pay for without expecting anything in return. And when you do the seva, it changes how you perform your action. And it changes this idea of I'm doing this for myself to I'm doing this to uplift others. And the moment you engage in seva, you will see huge transformation in how you perceive reality. You won't perceive it as division, but you'll perceive it as oneness. And in that realization, you'll go more into realizing who you are. So I would say seva and sangha, selfless service and community, are two great ways to access grace very easily. I think you're on mute.
I was so good for a minute there, wasn't I? So beautiful. Thank you so much. We always end our program asking our guests for immediate advice on what we can do right now. So it's what's known as the get off the couch moment. So you've given us a lot, a lot. And I'm very excited for all the information that is so helpful and useful to us as we find different ways to live in better states of being, to improve the human condition, and to create a world in which all thrive. And which is my personal mission and vision, as well as part and parcel of the mission and vision of Mindset, Heartset, Reset, which really is on a mission to spread love globally. And I find love to be synonymous with the divine source, whatever you want to call it, that state of beautiful bliss, oneness, ecstasy. But the get off the couch moment, although you've given us a lot of what to do and how to do it along this ladder, I wonder if there's a piece of advice that you would give us that we could, whoever's listening, whether it's in the recording or live, right now, could take that action in order to ensure that they either avoid the ladder of sorrow or step into greater grace or have that immediate centering and reset, what advice would you give to a listener now that they could do right now, an action they could take, an action on the insight, right? Knowledge is not power, knowledge is potential power. But if you take action on your insight, that's the power. How can you empower the listener now?
Learn a mantra. All you have to do is just Google it. You can even send me a message and I can share with you how you can learn it and start a practice. If you don't want to learn a mantra, go and help somebody. Right? There's lots of homeless people. Make some chai, make some sandwiches, go and serve them. If you don't want to do that, then go to a community gathering of people that you are inspired from. So you have three things that you can do immediately as soon as you finish listening to this.
Okay, I'm unmuting. I love that. You okay, so thank you very much for that. You have been amazing and brought us this beautiful novel information, and a wonderful new way to look at how we might improve our daily living, come into greater oneness, um, and have more love and joy in our lives. Thank you so much, Swami Chidananda. Please tell us, what are some of the ways to contact you? I know you have a YouTube channel. I was trying to figure out what the exact address was, and it gave me something that I didn't recognize. Is
I
it at Swami Chidananda 108?
I'm not sure. I think if anybody would want to know more, if they just go to the website, in the website there'll be a link to the YouTube channel. I would say that's probably the easiest way.
I think this is what I have on my. Oops, what did I do? There we go. This is what I have.
Could be. I would,
On
yeah,
my
I would say, yeah, I would
plus.
just say Swami.love. It's just the website. If they go there, they have it has all of the information.
Oh, everything's there. Okay, including,
Everything.
because I know you're quite active on Instagram as well.
I think Instagram is there as well. It's just the Instagram, I believe, is just Swami underscore Chidananda. But I believe all of it's there. And
So this is where everybody should go.
yeah.
Swami.love.
And then there they could send me a message. And if they want to learn the mantra chanting, then it's happy to do that on Instagram. I think there's a link. It's just Swami's underscore Chidananda.
And
Something
you
like
have a
that.
channel on Instagram as well.
Yeah. I share some Bhagavad Gita teachings and some other musings that might help provide some insights.
I'm always very excited when I see that there's a new post, because Swami comes on regularly and gives little clips and reels about some specific topic and some way that we might wake up to some beautiful new understanding. So catch Swami Chidananda on swami.love. You can find all the different ways you can connect to him. You can get him on Instagram. He's got his own channel. I subscribe to everything. I follow him everywhere. And he's got a YouTube channel which is absolutely wonderful. And maybe in the future we'll do The Scientist and the Monk again. We'll see if that works out. I love working with you. I absolutely am so grateful for getting to know you and for being able to become more enlightened, more compassionate, more loving, more intelligent and knowledgeable when I listen to you. So I'm very grateful for everything that you bring into the world, and for me personally. Thank you so much. Namaste, Swami.
Thank you so much, Doctor. It was always lovely to connect and catch up and speak. Thank you for hosting and thank you for sharing love with this world.
Thank you. Thank you for agreeing to be our guest today. It's been amazing. I've loved it. For those of you who have joined us live, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who are joining us on the recording, thank you so much for joining us. I encourage everybody to go back and listen to this episode again and take down your notes and really be able to commit this to a way of being able to live a much better life that is good for you and good for everybody else. Thank you so much, Swami Chidananda. Next week, again on Tuesday at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. British time, British summer time right now, 6 p.m. Central European time. We are live, and we, of course, have our recordings. Next week, we are joined with Glenn Morshower as we continue on our mental health series. Thank you, everyone. Namaste. Blessings.